Hello, good afternoon. I hope you're enjoying the Congress so far. And this is the fourth talk on stage Yale. And this time we have Svantje. She will tell you something about the complex nature of cellular roaming and how roaming is implemented in recent smartphones. I don't want to spoil, so have a warm welcome to the fabulous Svantje.
All right. All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to my talk. Great that so many of you are here today. I will talk about our work on how roaming agreements enable 5G machine-in-the-middle attacks. And this is a joint work with Francesca Gringoli, Matthias Hollig, and Jiske Klaassen. But first, I would like to introduce myself. I am Svantje Lange, and I'm a PhD student at Hasso-Plattner-Institut in Potsdam. And my work focuses on the security of cellular networks. So I'm looking into the different components like fake base stations, the implementation and behavior of smartphones, and SIM cards. But let's start with 5G roaming. We are already at the 5th generation of cellular networks, but high-value targets of state-sponsored attackers can hardly hide. High-value targets, who's that? That are usually people who are journalists, human rights activists, or politicians. And if they are kind of in the spotlight of their state, they really have issues here. Because we saw in the past that 2G was commonly used for rogue base stations attacks. Nowadays, you can just turn off 2G in current versions of Android and iOS. So like this attack surface is minimized. But then 3G came into place, and 3G introduced network authentication. With network authentication, the network has to authenticate to the phone, not only the phone to the network. Like this, we have a mutually authenticated connection, and this really limits the actual attack surface to the messages which are sent before the authentication. But yeah, since the system was not now more secure, people started to look into roaming, because roaming is a very complex system, so roaming could be used for attacks. We already had some very interesting talks about that at the past at CCC. And after 3G, there was 4G, as you probably know. With 4G, the cryptographic session keys were very much only bound to one network. So you could not trick the network to use one session key for multiple roaming networks. And like this, roaming got a bit more hardened. And with 5G, there was a so-called proof of presence added, which means that a visited network where a user is roaming has to prove to the user's home network that the user is really present in this visited network. So this is another thing that makes the roaming system more secure. But still, there are reports from the last years showing that law enforcement agencies and spyware vendors use roaming and the mechanisms of lawful interception to still exploit their target phones. So we wanted to know, how can they even do this? Because the system has so many mitigations right now. To understand how roaming can be abused, we first have to look into a legitimate roaming scenario. In the legitimate scenario, we have a user who is visiting another network. And the idea of roaming is that this user can still get cellular connection. So when roaming, the user connects to a visited network, and then this visited network asks the home network for a so-called authentication vector, which is necessary to establish a mutually authenticated connection. The operators of the visited network and the home network, they have a so-called roaming agreement, which is a contract that allows billing of the customers, so of our user here, and of the roaming partners, so they can bill each other with this. And if you look at lawful interception, we know that a network or an operator can only or is only allowed to intercept the traffic which is within their own coverage area. And this is easily possible, as cellular traffic usually only gets encrypted during the only over-the-air transmission. So it's encrypted between the base station and the phone. And at the base station, it gets decrypted, and then it is transmitted in plain text to the home network. So in the scenario over here, the visited network is allowed to intercept the traffic of the user, but the home network can only read the traffic if the traffic really gets home routed, so if it traverses the home network. When we now look what an attacker could do, one could think of an attacker who would pose to be part of the visited network. So this attacker might set up a rogue base station, and with this, they would set up a network looking like the visited network outside of the actual coverage area of this visited network. And like this, a phone not being in the actual area of the visited network could connect to the space station, and then we could still get a mutually authenticated connection, as the legitimate visited network would ask the home network for an authentication vector. For the home network, it is quite difficult to decide if such a request would be malicious or not, since actually we want that the user can roam. So we want a happy user who gets a connection, and we want to bill our roaming partners. So as billing is the main interest here, there's a high probability that the home network would just accept such a connection, since rejection would just have too many causes, and it's not clear if there's a request from a legitimate visited network, if it's illegitimate or not. Looking at the attacker assumed in this model, we have a state-sponsored attacker who collaborates with a mobile network operator, and like this, they may force the operator to get access to their lawful interception interfaces. And the attacker uses a software-defined radio as a rogue base station. And since network traffic can be routed globally, they could be located in the same country or in a different country as the mobile network operator they are collaborating with. Using this setup, our attacker tries to achieve a machine in the middle position. Because, as I already explained, the network traffic gets decrypted at the base station, and from the base station on it's transmitted in plain text. So the base station itself is a perfect candidate for a machine in the middle. You might know nowadays most of the traffic is encrypted using TLS. So the overhearing at the base station is indeed limited. But you might also know that state-sponsored attackers are really interested in getting to know as much as possible about their target. So they might acquire exploits for the baseband, for example, because baseband exploits are pretty reliable nowadays. Since baseband coding is very complex, it doesn't really have so many protections like stack canaries, and such a baseband exploit can, like this, serve as an entry point for a remote code execution, as an attacker might be able to exploit the baseband and, like this, get into the operating system of the phone. And if they're in the operating system, they can do whatever they want. They might install some spyware apps or exfiltrate data or whatever you can imagine. But how does all of this look like from the user's perspective? You might know that on Android and iOS, you usually see the name of the network you are connected to on top of the phone in the status bar. But where does this name come from? There are different sources for that. We have a list in the SIM card of network names and network IDs. The network ID always consists of a country code, which identifies the country, and a network code, which identifies the network within a country. So the SIM card can have a list of those network names and network IDs, but also the phone itself has a list of network names and network IDs. But it is assumed in the standard that those locally stored lists might be outdated. So actually the network itself provides an update mechanism. The network announces its name and its network ID. And if we are roaming, on Android at least, we see a little R indicating that the phone is roaming. But how can we use this knowledge for an attack? So as we just saw, the user has quite limited possibilities to observe the roaming themselves, because they only see a network name displayed, and they might see this small R. But the problem is that the network ID is the only mutually authenticated information in this whole authentication protocol. That means if the network would announce any name and a different network ID, the phone wouldn't realize that, and the user couldn't realize this either, because the user only sees this displayed name. So the idea is that for an attack, an attacker could choose a network name the user would expect to see. So if you're traveling to Spain and you just see a Spanish network name there, then you feel like you're connected to a legitimate network. But in real life, it could be somebody else posing as this Spain network. And an attacker could even make this roaming indicator disappear by just using the network ID your phone is bound to and your phone knows as your home network ID. So, like in the screenshot here, if you just announce that we are like having the network ID of your home network, then there's no roaming indicator anymore. And if we kind of want to perform this attack, then there's also always like this visited network, which kind of wrongfully requests for the authentication vector. And the home network has to check if such a request is legitimate, and only grants this authentication request to roaming partners to ensure the billing. The problem is that the phone or the user cannot observe which networks requested for the authentication vector for their connections. They might see it if it ends up on their bill, so they might learn about it afterwards. But I mean, you know, if you roam within the EU, for example, you usually don't see it on your bill, or if there's only very limited traffic, you might not see it on your bill either. And so you'll really be unclear about what connections your phone did connect to in the past. So a very obvious solution to a roaming attack is to turn off roaming, right? I mean, what else could you do? So like this, your phone would just say, okay, I only accept connections from your home network. Easy. The problem is if the base station just poses as your home network. So if the base station would just say, hey, I'm your home network. There, we face the problem that this announcement the base station is doing is sent before the authentication. So the phone actually has no measure to check if the network name and the network ID the base station is sending is legitimate or not. So the phone has to accept it. And if you look into the core network, we see that the home networks usually just block a request from visited networks they don't know. Here we have a similar problem. If they just get a request which coming from another network but seems to stem from their own network because all the parameters are set like this, the home network might accept the request. At least in our lab setup with Open5JS, the network would just say, okay, yeah, fine, it's a request from the inside, so I will just let the authentication go through. And in the end, such a connection would just look like a legitimate connection and even like a non-roaming connection on the phone. So the user doesn't have any measure to really observe what's going on here. Real operators might have so-called roaming firewalls in place, but there's no public information about those firewalls available, so we cannot really research it. We can just hope that they are strong enough and that the rules are correct. But yeah, not every operator might have the same firewall here. Another thing which makes the roaming system hard to comprehend is that actually for you to connect to any roaming network or to any network, when you're traveling to some country, your operator would have to have a lot of contracts. Because it would be nice if they would have a contract with some operator in any other country in the world, so you could just freely travel everywhere. But yeah, you see that would be quite complex. So what we actually have are roaming intermediaries. So those are third parties which are in the middle and they manage the contracts. The problem here is that things like trust or observability are worse having those intermediaries, since of course we have the intermediaries in place. Another thing which is part of the roaming system is that actually it is not clearly defined how the network traffic gets routed. So the visited network could either route the network traffic through the home network before it gets to the internet, or it could be routed to the internet directly. And having this in the specification, we see that, as you might have expected, the roaming specification is not focused on user privacy or observability of the roaming arrangements, because the roaming is just transparent to the user, and the user is unable to observe where the traffic flow goes through. And as we know of lawful interception, yeah, we don't know who might look into our traffic. But what could we do about that? How could we make the roaming system more secure? So one thing, of course, would be to employ some end-to-end encryption. Because right now, a rogue base station provides access to the decrypted traffic of any connected phone. And changing the system and not decrypting the traffic at the base station, but having an end-to-end encrypted traffic, already makes it more difficult for rogue base stations to be such an effective measure. A problem here is that if we would have end-to-end encrypted traffic, lawful interception would not be possible in the same way as it is right now. So law enforcement agencies might not like the idea to do it like this. Another thing we could think of is to have a visible trust chain. Because right now, the trust decision is only taken by the core network. So your home network checks the identity of the visited network requesting an authentication vector, and your home network checks the identity of the roaming intermediaries. But you as a user don't see any of those. So we could think of just showing the information which was used to build up the trust for the connection to the user. I mean, as you might know it from TLS, you can inspect the certificates, and then you know who's in the chain and what's behind your connection. Another thing we would like to have in cellular networks is that we would like the user to be able to inspect the network properties. Because right now, they don't even see the network ID by default. So the network could just pose as anyone, and yeah, you have to believe what you see on the screen. But you might imagine that if we would like to see the trust chain, we should be able to build up the trust chain and to really propagate information about the trust chain to the phone. So that would require a change in the specification, since we would have to pass this information through. And of course, the user interface design of these phones should be changed, because like this, it would just be easier to inspect the network properties or trust chain information without installing special apps. But since we don't have those mitigations yet, we could think of how a user could realize that their roaming connection is abused. One idea is to trace out the path the traffic is taking. Because like this, you could just see if your network traffic takes the usual path or if it's routed differently. Could work. Another idea is that you use any of the related work according to detect rogue base station, because there are apps for rooted Android devices, for example, who try to inspect the signal properties of the signal, and like this, they may just raise a suspicion. Right. But usually for those rogue base station detection, if you use a rooted Android phone for that, you see it's like more effort required. And since nowadays rogue base stations might be very specialized. It's also not so easy to detect. So we think, or we thought that it could be possible to just measure the time of the authentication, since in a roaming scenario there are more steps involved, so the authentication might just take longer. But in reality, yeah, we had some timing measurements and they didn't show a significant difference between a roaming scenario and a non-roaming scenario. This might also be due to routing decisions, since routing can be different. But what really users could do themselves is, at first, to mitigate the attack surface for rogue base station attacks in general, is to disable 2G. So on iOS nowadays, you can enable the lockdown mode. You can find it in the settings, in the privacy and security settings. And if you enable the lockdown mode, then 2G is automatically disconnected. That doesn't mean that it's not working for emergency calls. So if you're in an emergency situation and there's no 3G, 4G, 5G available, then your phone is still using 2G, but your phone is kind of protected against those simple rogue base station attacks where just somebody puts up a base station and your phone would connect to it. But the thing of the lockdown mode is that it also imposes a lot of security measures on other apps. So the behavior of your apps might change, or you might have to really check, because usually lockdown mode is like, okay, this app behavior could be changed, so if you don't want it to be changed, then you might want to disable lockdown mode for this app. So yeah, it's actually meant for people who are really think that they are targeted for any kind of attack. And on Android and current Android, it's a bit easier. There you can just disable the connection to 2G in the network settings. Another thing you could do is that when you're roaming, that you then turn off the automatic network selection. Because in roaming, usually your phone might switch the networks, depending on signal strength or whatever. And if you turn this off, you really have to take a conscious decision which network you will connect to. The thing is, you could also be tricked into a connection, but it's less likely since you really have to pick it yourself. And there's no connection which you didn't notice because it's only a very short time and your phone did it automatically. So this part of the attack is mitigated. And another thing you could do if you are having an iPhone, you could join the CellGuard beta test. CellGuard is an app developed at TU Darmstadt. And with this app, we are collecting information on how your phone connects to base stations. And if there's something suspicious about it, so if the signal strength is lower than usual, or if there are some weird rejections in the path, then the app might warn you about those suspicious connections. Concluding on our work on how roaming agreements enable 5G machine-in-the-middle attacks, we must say that the 5G roaming security really is focused on preventing billing fraud. And like this, machine-in-the-middle attacks are possible, and they are still actively exploited. So the problem is that it is very difficult for a trusted operator to decide if an authentication request is legitimate or not. And because if they reject it, then they might have a loss in revenue or an unhappy user somewhere. The smartphones are unable to verify a roaming decision and the trust assumption behind the connection. So you as a user can only see a very limited part of this connection. And the visited network, so the network you are connecting you to when you are roaming, can actually arbitrarily choose the network name displayed on the phone. So like this, users can be easily tricked into connections. I think that we need some major change in the system to make it more secure and to prevent machine-in-the-middle attacks in the future. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Swantje, for this really, really interesting talk. I bet you in the audience have many questions to her. So give us a sign if you want my microphone.
Hello, thank you for the amazing talk, and we really see that in the fifth generation it's still a clusterfuck because all the protocols are built for profit and not for protecting people. So I hope this work contributes to that. And my specific question is, in the beginning you said that for this kind of attack it is good to have a state actor. So my question is, why do you need a state actor to pull off the attack? Thank you very much.
Okay, so the idea is that a state-sponsored attacker usually has better means to really convince a legitimate visited network to work together with them. That's one thing. I mean, you could also be somebody with a lot of money and say like, here. And the other thing is that as we kind of introduced this aspect that the attacker might have a baseband exploit, that's also part of why we said it could be a state-sponsored attacker, since baseband exploits are not so cheap. So it's usually more what a state-sponsored attacker do. And actually, when we read the reports, usually what happens is really kind of state-motivated. So yeah, we think that probably state-sponsored actors are in place here.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I wanted to ask how big part of it, of this leaking of authentication vectors, is due to just those roaming intermediaries being negligent, and how big part of it is that it's a gate to unlawful intersection. Because the state actors can use the lawful interception, at least in their countries, right? But the unlawful one is not really possible unless you have a gate. And how much of it is just a negligence, and how much of it is by design?
Okay, so I think that contained quite some questions. So the thing is, it is called lawful interception because it is actually really defined by the standard that there are interfaces and that states or law enforcement agencies are able to inspect network traffic or cellular traffic within their country. So this law enforcement agency is actually really able or allowed to go to an operator and say, hey, we need some data about, I don't know, who was in this cell connected, I don't know, yesterday, something like that. So this is called lawful interception, that there's just like a rule or some specification really allowing this to happen. And the thing is, since it is there and since the traffic is actually plain text traffic in the back end, yeah, people can use it. So if like the wrong people use it, then they get access to something they should not have access to.
Yeah, thank you for the very interesting talk. What I'm very curious about is now the roaming intermediaries. Who are these companies? Where are they based? Under what jurisdiction? And there are also quite large unlawful state actors. And it might be a good idea for an unlawful state actor with a lot of money to run such a roaming intermediary, maybe at the lowest cost provider because the monetization is somewhere else. So what do you know about these intermediaries?
Actually, there's not so much public knowledge about the intermediaries. We know that there are like companies which you can find if you really dig into it, then you can find them. Those kind of have a big impact since they collaborate with a lot of different operators. And yeah, they are potentially based all over the world. So because they are in the middle of the system, so it's not that you can say, oh yeah, that's like this server being based in Germany or something like that. No, it's rather somewhere, and that's the problem with the trust in the system, right? That you have those companies sitting in the middle, and you don't know 100% who's controlling it and what are they doing with it. Yeah.
Yeah, also thanks from me for the great talk. I have one question regarding a countermeasure. Did you look into maybe using some physical layer security scheme? I mean, 5G offers several like integrated sensing kind of measures where maybe a phone would be able to derive roughly a position of the base station and then say, oh, this is probably not a legitimate base station, or this is nothing I'm trusting, something like this.
Yeah, so actually, in this work, we more looked into the specification and how the phones behave if you just send random network names, for example, to them. But what we do is if you have the CellGuard app, so we have like kind of the CellGuard app for a rogue base station detection, and this app really uses a location database to know where a base station is to be expected, and if there's a base station which is just popping up and it's not in the database, then it also gets some suspicion points, so to say.
A lot of mobile phone providers have the option that you can disable roaming entirely in their own GUI when you log into your account. Do any of those fake home network attacks still work if roaming is just disabled on the carrier side because the user may enable that configuration?
Yeah, so I think if you disable the roaming, then we have just the problem that I showed, that if the network poses to be the home network, the phone is unable to distinguish if it really is the home network sending a message. So for the phone, it really looks like it would be the home network contacting the phone. I mean, if you really block the carrier, maybe it's like, then the carrier would block authentication requests. I don't know of that because I didn't look into this. But it could be possible, yeah.
Hello. Have you looked at Elon Musk's Starlink network? Because they can do the same attacks from low Earth orbit.
No, we haven't looked at Starlink in this work. But would be interested to see what's possible there, yeah.
From a very practical standpoint, because first of all, telecommunication network today are a shit like 20 years ago, basically, never improved. But from a threat modeling and effective attack from the end user perspective, given that the mobile network is somehow, from a data perspective, untrusted, exactly like an internet connection it is, what are the real risk in a nowadays, let's say, modern endpoint device? I foresee SMS PIN recovery as the only one that came up to my mind. But have you done a threat modeling of which are the effective attack that can be done other than the theoretical one?
Okay, so we didn't do such a threat modeling at this work, but I can say that, of course, the SMS is completely unencrypted, so yeah, you can do whatever you want. I mean, the more TLS connections you have in the system, the more secure it gets. And as I showed, this is like an attack which is usually used to target single persons. So the risk for everybody in the room might be quite low, other than if you're like a very important human rights activist in a country not doing so much about human rights. That might be different, but usually this is a quite expensive attack, so it's really targeted on single persons.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I got two quick questions. One is, are you aware of any malicious actors actually using these weaknesses in the wild? Have you had any signs of compromise traced somewhere?
Yeah, so in our research, we didn't look so much at the compromise, but we just read the reports which were out there from Amnesty Tech or Citizen Lab, and they really said, okay, there were some roaming attacks on certain persons. So, and if you know the person which got attacked, and if it's like a politician in a certain country, you might have the suspicion
Sure.
that who
All right.
could be the
And another quick one. You said, I mean, I wanted to ask if when you set up your rogue base station, does it just connect to the upstream providers over the plain internet? Is it, or do you need access to some special networks?
So usually if you set up a base station, then you have to connect to the core network of the operator. And this is different than the plain internet. So like this, you really have to connect to the interfaces of the operator, because actually the traffic, which is like authenticating a phone in the network, only goes through those special cellular networks. So you have to contact the core network and you have to kind of log in as a base station. And if the base station is there, then you can say, hey, I have a customer here. Do we want to authenticate the customer? And then you can ask the core network, and the core network will then provide the authentication vectors or ask the roaming partner to provide those.
Yes, thanks for the talk as well. I have one question. How can this be fixed without relying on external parties? So if we forget about the remote code injection into the baseband for a moment, the way I have understood your talk is like, please correct me if I'm wrong, you need to have end-to-end encryption of the user plane, at least from the device into the core network of the mobile network operator, of the home network operator, or even better, to a VPN gateway outside of that in your own control. So is that kind of the solution for today? If you think that is something that is targeted towards you, that you have a VPN on your device and then only allow internet traffic over that VPN right from the start of the connection, is that the solution today?
I'm not sure if you can. So I mean, having such a VPN would be, of course, very good for your surfing in general. But the problem is that if you get like phone calls or SMS, they are still in the cellular world. So you cannot really, as a user, you cannot really steer how they get transmitted. And with this, yeah, you're not the person who decides what happens here. But yeah, for your internet traffic, having a VPN is always a good idea. But I mean, if you would have like an end-to-end encryption, that's already quite good, I would say.
Hi, thanks a lot for the talk, very interesting. Just a quick question, you said that it's pretty expensive to run such an attack. Like, what is it exactly? Like, how much does it cost for people to do this kind of stuff?
I mean, I didn't calculate it through, but the thing is, if you want to have a rogue base station, which is really a rogue base station in the quality that your phone would connect to it, then you would like have a good SDR already, which can be like 10,000 euros, I think. I mean, if you try to set up your own test network, you realize that it's already a bit hard to get a legitimate test connection to run. So having a rogue base station is a bit harder. And I mean, for the exploits, you can look it up online what exploits cost, but that's usually very high cost. So, but I didn't calculate it through, so it's what you can do. Yeah.
Okay, before I close this session, I would like to say a big thanks to all the hardworking angels on this Congress who make this Congress possible. Please give them an applause. And thank you to all our wonderful speakers like Svantje. This was really, really outrageous, interesting, inspiring. Thank you so much. And this is your applause.
Thank you.